In the previous video, we learned about the difference between classic EC2s and EC2s in a VPC. We also discussed coping with a mixed environment and migrating the classic EC2s into a VPC. We also talked about the easiest way to get started with VPCs using the default VPC. In this video, we will demonstrate two methods to create your own VPC. The first method will be using the VPC wizard, which can give us a VPC with private subnets and even a NAT instance. The second method will show all the steps for building a VPC from scratch. To get started, log into the Management Console and on the Services menu, select VPC under the Networking category. You will notice that one VPC is already listed. This is the default VPC. To create a new VPC, click on Start VPC Wizard. There are four possible options. The first one is a very basic VPC with a single public subnet. The second one is a VPC with a public instance containing a NAT instance or NAT gateway and a private subnet. The third one adds a virtual private gateway, and that allows you to make a hardware VPN connection back to your data center. The fourth one takes away the public subnet and just leaves the private subnet with a hardware VPN connection to your data center. Let's pick the second one for our demo, which will create a public subnet, a private subnet, and a NAT. For the VPC CIDR block, let's just leave it as 10.0.0.0/16, and let's name the VPC Training Demo. Let's also leave the public subnet CIDR block as it is, 10.0.0.0/24. For now, let's not choose an availability zone, and one will be randomly assigned. Let's call the public subnet public 1. For the private subnet, we will leave it 10.0.1.0/24. And we'll call the private subnet private 1. In this next section, we can choose to launch a NAT gateway or a NAT instance on our public subnet. For this demo, let's launch a NAT instance. Pick the instance type you would like to launch. Remember, the larger the instance, the higher the network bandwidth, and then a private key pair associated with your account. The next section allows us to add a VPC endpoint for S3. We could leave the default settings. Let's also leave the Enable DNS hostname on. This means our instances with private IP addresses will have a DNS hostname as well. Leave hardware tenancy as default and then click on Create VPC. After a few minutes, your VPC will have been created. Click on OK to see your new VPC. However, to get the most control, you can create a VPC from scratch without the VPC wizard. Click on Create VPC. In the pop-up, give your VPC a name and enter an IP address block using CIDR notation. A /16 is a typical size, and this gives your VPC 65,536 private IP addresses it can use. You can leave the tenancy option as default, but just so you know what this is, the other option, Dedicated Tenancy, makes it so that any instance you launch in this VPC will be launched in a host server on which you are the only customer. In other words, with the default tenancy, your EC2 instances get created on host machines that are shared by other AWS customers. But with dedicated tenancy, only your dedicated instances will run on that host machine. No other customers will share it. This is sometimes required for security compliances or strict software licenses that are not cloud friendly. Of course, additional hourly charges apply. Click Yes, Create, and you should see your new VPC appear. If you want your VPC to have internet access, you need to attach an internet gateway. In the navigation, click Internet Gateways, and then Create Internet Gateway. Give it a name, and then click Yes, Create. The next step is to select the Internet Gateway and then click Attach to VPC. Click the VPC you just created and then click Yes, Attach. Now let's create some subnets. In the navigation, click Subnets and then Create Subnet. Give it a name. We're going to make this a public subnet, so let's call it Public 1. Click the VPC we just created and select any availability zone. Enter a CIDR block. Remember, this must be a subset of the IP address range you gave your VPC. So let's make this a /24, which will give it 251 available addresses. Remember that 5 addresses are taken by AWS. And since we want this to be a public subnet, we have to give our subnet a route to the Internet through the Internet Gateway. In the navigation, click Route Tables and then Create Route Table. Give it a name like Public Route Table and select your VPC. Click Yes, Create. Select the new route table and then on the Route tab, click Edit and add another route. For the destination, type 0.0.0.0/0, which is the way we specify the entire Internet. Click in the target box and then click the Internet Gateway we just created. Click Save. Now that we have created the route table, let's associate it with our subnet. Click the Subnet Associations tab and then click Edit. Select our public subnet and click Save. Now let's put a NAT gateway in our new subnet. Click on NAT Gateways and then create a NAT gateway. Click in the subnet box and then select our public subnet. Click on Create New EIP so our gateway will have an elastic IP so it can access the Internet. Finally, click Create a NAT gateway. Now let's create a private subnet and then give it a route through the NAT gateway to access the Internet and public AWS services. Back in the navigation, click Subnets and then Create Subnet. Give it a name. Let's call it Private 1. Click the VPC we just created and select any availability zone. Enter a CIDR block that won't overlap with our public subnet. And click Yes, Create. Now let's create a route table for our private subnet. In the navigation, click Route Tables and then Create Route Table. Give it a name, this time Private Route Table, and select your VPC. Click Yes, Create. Select the new route table and then the Routes tab and then click Edit and add another route. For the destination, type 0.0.0.0/0 and in the target box, click the NAT gateway we just created and click Save. Finally, let's associate that route table with our private subnet, so click on the Subnet Associations tab and then Edit. Select our private subnet and then click Save. You can keep creating subnets if you like. In a later section, we will show you how to take advantage of multiple availability zones to make your application environment highly available. In this video, we created a simple VPC, first using the VPC wizard, and then we did one from scratch. We created the VPC, attached an Internet Gateway, created private and public subnets, route tables, and launched a NAT gateway in our public subnet. In the next video, we will discuss several ways to connect to your VPCs, including VPNs and Direct Connect.